Well, I want to thank Andrew for inviting me, and I want to thank the Society of Cincinnati for putting this on. And I'm going to be honest with you, this book's only been out a few weeks, and you are the first ones to hear this talk, which I literally finished this PowerPoint yesterday. Or no, Monday. It was actually Monday I finished it. So if I stumble here and there, I'm not used to this one, so bear with me, okay? So the book covers a lot, but with my 45 minutes, 50 minutes tonight, I can't try to cover everything in the book. So what we are going to focus on tonight is an overview of everything that happened on the Delaware River from, say, early October through late November is what we're going to focus on tonight. Try to get through that in the next 45 to 50 minutes. But I don't want to just jump you into that without any background. Remember that the Philadelphia campaign began up in northern New Jersey in the spring and summer of 1777. Washington had been in winter quarters around Morristown. This is, just to set you up in the chronology, this is after the battles of Trenton and Princeton. This is the next spring, okay? The British spent the winter along the Raritan River. And so initially you have maneuvering in northern New Jersey. And then when William Howe loads his British army onto the fleet, Washington's not sure where they're going to go. So for a while, he is going to hang out up here along the Hudson River near the New York-New Jersey border, waiting to figure out which way the British are going to go. And eventually the British are going to depart New York Harbor in mid-July. And when they depart, Washington has to figure out where they're going. And they're going to be spotted passing Little Egg Harbor. That's roughly where Atlantic City is today. And that's what causes Washington to start shifting his divisions from the Hudson Highlands south. And they are just approaching the Delaware River here in late July when the British fleet enters Delaware Bay. So this is kind of a key point in the campaign. It's a key point in the Revolution, in my opinion. Because what was the status of the Delaware River defenses at the end of July 1777? All right, so here's your British fleet entering the Delaware Bay. So this is what's eventually going to be in the Delaware River. This is what we're going to focus on tonight. There's eventually going to be 3 forts. Fort Billingsport, by the end of July, had not been built yet. Fort Mercer had not been built yet by the end of July. Fort Mifflin existed in some form. About half of it was built, but there was no troops in it at the end of July. Now, the real issue for the British fleet, if they had chosen to come up the Delaware River at this point, were the obstructions sunk in the river. And that's what these lines here represent. These were obstructions called chevaux de frise. They look like this. All right, imagine a log cabin with its roof removed and then filled with stone and sunk in the river. And then there was these large spikes that stuck out that had metal tips, and these were all chained together. These stop ships from going upriver. One of these long poles was salvaged after Superstorm Sandy. If you remember that big storm that hit the coast, because it churned up the Delaware River, and one of these came to the surface. So this is now on display in the Brandywine Battlefield Visitor Center. So that's an original one. It's one of those spikes sticking out. So these were real obstructions. And so that now I highlight them in red there for you. So the British fleet would have had to remove these to get upriver. Now, the other problem is William Howe told the king he would only land on the Delaware River if the Americans were still in New Jersey. And without getting into all this bogged down in detail tonight, he is told by a British officer, Andrew Hammond, who was on blockade duty in the Delaware River, that the Americans had crossed the Delaware River and were in Pennsylvania. It was not an accurate report. But that's what he tells William Howe at the end of July. And so based on that, William Howe goes back out to sea. And so when he departs on July 31st to go around the Delmarva Peninsula, in my opinion, this is the moment that dooms John Burgoyne at Saratoga. Because the moment William Howe chooses to do this, there is zero chance he can come back to New York to help John Burgoyne. If you know what happens to John Burgoyne, he's going to surrender at Saratoga in October. In many ways, this is the turning point of the revolution, because this is the moment Burgoyne is doomed, in my humble opinion. All right, so he goes around, you can see here, they go around, and on August 25th, they're going to start to offload on the Elk River at a place called Turkey Point, near the modern town of Elkton, Maryland. By that point, Washington has moved the army, is starting to move the army in the northern Delaware. This is August 25th when they start to offload. And you can see here, then you've got this campaign through northeastern Maryland, northern Delaware, and you're going to have several battles before you get the capture of Philadelphia. Now, mind you, while all this is happening, they're building these forts. So those forts that weren't built at the end of July are now being constructed while all this land movement is happening. So you get September 3rd, Battle of Coutras Bridge, largest battle in the history of Delaware. September 11th, Battle of Brandywine. September, I'm trying to get my dates right, 20th is Battle of Paoli. September 16th is the Battle of the Clouds. Then you get the British occupation of Philadelphia on September 26th. Now, what's important here to know is that even though they have Philadelphia, they do not control the river at this point. So then Washington is going to launch an attack on Germantown. Most of the British army at this point, this is October 4th, is camped in the village of Germantown. And so he launches this attack. I think the purpose of that attack was to drive that British garrison deep down into Philadelphia. Why would Washington want to do that? Well, if you notice here, colonial Philadelphia sits on a peninsula formed by the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River. So today, if you go to Philadelphia, it's on both sides of the Schuylkill. That's not true in the 18th century. So if you could drive the British down into this peninsula and control the roads on the land side, and then you continue to control the forts, they can't feed the army. He wants to starve them out like he did at Boston in early 1776. I think that was the ultimate goal. So that's how you end up with the Battle of Germantown on October 4th. That sets up everything that's going to happen on the river. So hopefully that little bit of background helps as I dive into the river stuff. Okay, so let's back up. All right, the day after the capture of Philadelphia, so they occupy Philadelphia on September 26th with a British column. And then on September 27th, the Americans in the river, there was a naval fleet, mixture of Continental ships and Pennsylvania naval, like militia ships. It's a combined fleet, and they're down here by Fort Mifflin. I don't think they realized that the British had marched into the city, because on the 27th, Commodore John Hazelwood, this guy, orders Captain Charles Alexander to take a small flotilla and approach Philadelphia and see what the situation is. This is the day after the British occupation. And the largest ship that they're going to use for this is the Continental frigate, the Delaware. Here's a picture of it. And they are going to move up. Here's the ships they take, if you're into these kind of details. So it's 3 ships and then these little rowboat galleys that have a single gun in them. All right. And as they come around this bend, you see how the river bends here, they're going to find British artillery pieces planted on the wharfs of Philadelphia. And a firefight breaks out. British artillery opens up on them from one of these piers sticking out into the river. And this guy, this is John Montresor, he's a British engineer officer. He says, we opened upon them, and the artillery was extremely well directed against that ship, the Delaware. Don't confuse this with the river. This is a ship, okay? And it starts to take holes. It's going to catch on fire also. This is Montresor again. She was 2 or 3 times on fire owing to one of our shot having drove through her cookhouse, it not being easily extinguished. So the ship's on fire. And they lose control of it because they're more worried about putting the fire out than managing the sails of the ship. And she runs aground. And as a result, Alexander, the captain of the ship, strikes her colors, surrenders the ship, and the British are going to take it. They're going to come on, put the fires out, and they're going to drag the disabled ship up to the wharfs and fix it. So now the largest ship that the Americans have on the river now belongs to the British. And more importantly, it's above the river obstructions because the rest of the British fleet is below all those river obstructions we talked about. Okay, this is the day after the occupation of Philadelphia. All right, this is, I'm trying to remember who this is. Francis Dowman, he's a Royal Artillery officer, so he's a British officer. And he explains what happens here. The men neglected the management of the sails and she ran aground, which is exactly what I just described to you. Okay, so now move forward another day, September 28th. And so if you're thinking logically, for the British fleet to move, because they've now come around, back around the Delmarva Peninsula and back to the Delaware River. All right, so they need to move from south to north. Well, if you remember that earlier map I showed you, the farthest fortification to the south was a place called Fort Billingsport. If you know the Philadelphia area at all today, it's the modern town of Paulsboro, New Jersey. There's a little park there with some monuments, but there's nothing left of the fort, but there is a little park there. So on the 28th, Howe orders 2 regiments, the 10th and 42nd Regiments of Foot, to march from the camp at Germantown. So this is before the Battle of Germantown. They're to march to the city or the village of Chester, ferry across to New Jersey, and assault Billingsport and take it out. So that's the first fort he wants to eliminate as a threat. All right, so October 1st, they are going to ferry over from Chester. So this is a modern view from where they crossed. This is Chester over here, or just the north side of Chester. And I'm standing at the old ferry crossing on the New Jersey side when I take this picture. It's a very potholed road. You might not want to drive down that with your car if you like your suspension system. All right, but you can, it is still an accessible point. So this is where they crossed, and then they have to march inland. So this is by the night of October 1st, they're camped just across the river. So here's Chester, and here's where they're trying to get to. All right, so there is New Jersey militia operating in the area, and that's who these guys here are. That's your lower block of blue. And there's Pennsylvania militia inside the fortification under a guy named William Bradford. So this is the night of the 1st. And this is Joseph Bloomfield. He's recovering from a wound he received at Brandywine, and he's in the house of a doctor, I think it's Otto Botto, I think his name is, but he's in the doctor's house recovering from his Brandywine wound. And this is what he writes in his journal. Their light horses came twice to the house where I lay after the doctor, who was a militia colonel and an active man against them, but not knowing I was in the house, I fortunately escaped their search. So he doesn't get captured while he's recovering in this house. But then the next day, the British are going to move against the New Jersey militia. So they want to drive this New Jersey militia back to open up access to the road that led to Fort Billingsport. So you end up with this skirmish with New Jersey militias. Their commander is a guy named Silas Newcomb. He's a New Jersey militia officer general, actually. And he said about 9 in the morning, the enemy advanced within a few hundred yards of where we were drawn up, when a pretty brisk fire from both sides issued. We now discover their numbers to be greatly superior to what they had been represented. And so they're going to get pushed back beyond Mantua Creek. This is a creek running right through here. So they pushed them back beyond Mantua Creek. And when they do that, that exposed the road that led to Billingsport. All right, back to Bloomfield. He's not a big fan of the New Jersey militia, specifically Silas Newcomb. And he said, the old granny of a general, pretending with 300 undisciplined men to make a stand, but soon retreated helter-skelter with his men, who eminently distinguished themselves by the swiftness of their heels. All right, so that's Joseph Bloomfield, the wounded guy, writing this. So that exposes the road. So Newcomb's going to retire to Woodbury, and the British don't care about Newcomb. So they are going to turn and move towards Fort Billingsport. All right, this is William Bradford. He's the Pennsylvania militia officer in charge here. And he realizes he can't hold the fort against these guys. So they're trying to evacuate the fort, get as much stuff out of there as they can on the boats and row over to Fort Mifflin. And this is what he writes after the battle, or after the little fight. About 12 o'clock, the enemy came on so close through a cornfield that they were not more than 30 yards from us and began the fire on us before our boat put off the shore. We returned the fire with six muskets we had on board. And so he's describing escaping from the fort. And that's the cover of the book. So this fort, Billingsport's up on a cliff here. And this is Continental Marines trying to help these militia guys get the stuff out of the fort. But if you've seen my new book, that's the cover of the new book. Okay. All right. Now, what's strange is that these two British regiments choose not to continue north. Fort Mercer was being built at this point, but there was nobody in it. He could have marched north and taken out Fort Mercer within a couple days, and there was nothing the Americans could have done about it. He does not have orders to do that and goes back to Pennsylvania. And what's fascinating about this is, had they taken out Fort Mercer, Fort Mifflin would have had to be abandoned because that's the supply line. With the British in Philadelphia, the only way to get reinforcements and supplies to Fort Mifflin is to ferry it over from Fort Mercer. So the British don't do that, which is going to cause them a lot of problems. But with Fort Billingsport removed, they're going to be able to start removing the obstructions here. And then once they remove those obstructions, they can get closer to the next line of obstructions. Okay. So fast forward a little bit now. It's October 11th. It's now 9 days later. And the British have started to build land batteries on the Pennsylvania side to bombard Fort Mifflin. They're building mortar batteries and howitzer batteries on the Pennsylvania shore. Now, if you've ever been there, Fort Mifflin today does not sit on an island. But in the 18th century, it sat on Mud Island, and there was this back channel. Today, this has all been filled in. This is, in fact, this is where the Philadelphia airport sits today. If you ever visit Fort Mifflin, you can almost reach up and touch the planes. You're that close. All right, you're right at the end of one of the runways. In fact, these batteries are now where the runways are. Okay. So they're trying to build batteries. And on the 11th, the commander of Fort Mifflin, a guy named Samuel Smith, a Maryland Continental officer, is going to order an attack from his garrison to try to take out these troops building these batteries. And this is October 11th. And he has a little bit of success. He's going to capture 60 British soldiers before the British rush reinforcements in. And then he's going to put these guys in boats and make them prisoners of war. So they're trying to prevent the British from building these land batteries. This is mid-October. And William Howe's getting frustrated because no food or very little food is coming into the city. And that's a problem not only for his army, but also for the civilians in Philadelphia. There's just a trickle of supplies coming in. And the building of the land batteries is taking entirely too long in the eyes of Howe. Those two islands, let me back up here. These two islands, Providence Island and Carpenter's Island, are basically flooded meadows. So these guys are working in knee-deep, waist-deep mud and filth and nastiness, trying to build these land batteries, and it's taking forever. And so Howe's frustrated. And so to speed up opening the river, he orders a Hessian column of 4 regiments plus a battalion of Jaegers to ferry across to what's today Camden and march inland and attack Fort Mercer. So that is his next plan. And so these guys get ferried across. He gives the order on the 20th. They're going to go with 8 3-pound Hessian guns plus 2 British howitzers. It's a total column of 2,200 men. And at that time, there's only 500 Rhode Island troops garrisoning Fort Mercer. So they are going to ferry over. Here's Carl von Donop. He's the commander of the operation, Hessian officer. They're going to ferry over on October 21st. Again, if you know the area at all, this is just above where the battleship New Jersey is now moored. If you ever want to go visit the battleship New Jersey, that's where they crossed, basically. And then they're going to march inland, and they're going to have to push back New Jersey militia that's out there harassing their march. But they're going to push into Haddonfield that night. This is Ludwig von Worm. He's the commander of the Jaeger Battalion. And he writes that 100 rebels, that's these New Jersey militiamen, retired into the woods and disquieted our march on all sides. So they keep getting skirmished and nipped at by these New Jersey militia while they're pushing inland. And that's what Worm is describing here. But eventually they end up in Haddonfield that night. So that sets up their march of the next day. And the fastest way, they have to cross this creek, the Big Timber Creek here. The fastest way to do that was to cross at a bridge that was right here by the Buck Tavern to get to Fort Mercer. But when they get there, they find that the New Jersey militia has destroyed the bridge. And so they can't cross there. So they're going to have to backtrack, and you can see the arrows here. I think I have it here, to another bridge farther upstream called Clements Bridge, and then cross there and march to Fort Mercer. This turns into a 17-mile march, which ironically is the same distance the British flanking column took to attack Washington at Brandywine. That was also 17 miles. And if you know Civil War stuff a little bit, it's also the same distance that Stonewall Jackson marched at Chancellorsville to flank the Northern Army at the Battle of Chancellorsville, 17 miles. Kind of ironic. And so by early afternoon, they are now approaching Fort Mercer. And when they're about a mile out, they run into or actually no, 3 miles out, Christopher Green, who's the commander of the fort, cousin of Nathaniel Green, sends out 3 officers to scout out what's going on. He had been getting reports from the New Jersey militia that these Hessians were approaching, but he wanted more information. So these 3 officers ride out, and this little skirmish erupts about 3 miles from the fort. This is a Rhode Island officer, Robert Rogers. He said, "We discovered each other upon their seeing us. They discharged a whole volley of musketry at us, which through the goodness of kind Providence hurt neither of us." And so this is just an image representing him. And then he writes, so they hightail it back to the fort, and he said, "I arrived safe at the fort where we thought ourselves safe as a mouse in a cheese." It's a great quote. That's why I had to use it for this talk. All right. So he gets back to the fort, and now Greene knows they're close. And so by 1 o'clock, they are now just beyond the open clearing that the Americans had created in the wood line near Fort Mercer. And again, Christopher Green's got 500 guys in the fort. And there's Christopher Green. Okay. And they're going to assault the fort late that afternoon, early evening. 3 of the 4 Hessian regiments are going to assault. And you can see here, I have it highlighted in red, the direction they're going to come from. Now, what's important to know here is that when the Americans created this fort, it was huge. You could see the original outline of the fort here. And when a French engineer officer, a guy named Duplessis, showed up to help the Americans, he's like, "You don't only have 500 guys. This fort is way too big for 500 guys." And so he reduced the fort. You see here, he built a new wall, reducing the fort by 2/3. And so this is going to mess the Hessians up. The Hessians had created fascines, which are bundles of sticks, so that when they got to the ditch, they threw the fascines in the ditch so they could walk across the ditch and get over the wall. So when they hit this abandoned part of the fort, they threw all their fascines in, thought they had got into the fort, and they actually cried out victory when they got into the abandoned part of the fort. And then they turned, and the American Navy fires into their flank, and then they're going to get eviscerated by the Americans in the fort. So to make this kind of quick here, because we have more to get to, they are bloodily repulsed. Von Donop is going to be mortally wounded, and this will prove to be the only American victory of the entire Philadelphia campaign. They lost all the other battles. But this one's a success. Christopher Green did very well here. So just to give you an idea of how big of a success this is, the 500 Rhode Islanders win this at the loss of 14 killed, 23 wounded, and 1 captured. 7% of the garrison. Some of these guys were casualties because during the fight, one of the cannons exploded, wounding the gunners. And that exploded cannon is still on display at the fort. That's it there. Okay. The Hessians, 370 casualties, 17% of the attacking force. And again, I had mentioned this earlier, Von Donop was mortally wounded. All right. So the Fort Mercer thing did not work. All right. There's Von Donop. He's mortally wounded. Okay. So the next day, October 23rd, the British fleet has now removed enough of the obstructions down by Billingsport to move ships up that are close enough to bombard Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin. In the middle of that operation, the HMS Augusta and the HMS Merlin, here's the Augusta, ran aground on a sandbar, and they're stuck. And meanwhile, there are artillery rounds coming in from Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin. The American Navy is launching fire rafts to try to set them on fire. That doesn't work. But eventually this ship catches fire. And there's been a lot of theory out there of what made it catch on fire. And I could tell you, because I found the court-martial documents that this captain went through for why he lost his ship. The Marines in the ship were firing their muskets at the American Navy guys. And the firing of the muskets set their hammocks on fire. And then the hammocks fire spread to the rest of the ship. So it was caused just by accident, not by hot shot, not by fire rafts. There's a lot of reasons in earlier books of why this happened, but it was just an accident. And this ship, that fire will spread, and this ship's going to explode. This is, I couldn't find a picture of him. Ambrose Searle is the secretary to Lord Richard Howe, who's the admiral of the fleet. He's the brother of the land general, William Howe. And Searle writes, "It caught on fire upon the poop deck by a Marine firing into a hammock, which, being unperceived, communicated to the shrouds, and from thence to other parts past all prevention." So there's what I was just describing to you. And it exploded. It was a massive explosion. Washington had ridden into Germantown and climbed to the top of a house called Cliveden. If you're not familiar with the Battle of Germantown, I don't want to get into the details of that, but he climbed to the top of the house of Cliveden and was observing the naval battle because that's a high point. He could see it from the top of that house. And they saw the mushroom cloud rise from this explosion. It shattered windows in Philadelphia. It could be heard as far away as Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was that big of an explosion. And then the Merlin, which was also aground, is also going to be abandoned and set on fire by its crew so it can't fall into American hands. That is today the view of where it sank. This is below Fort Mercer. So this is roughly the spot in the river today where it sank. Now, what's cool about the Augusta, and I think it's kind of cool, is that for the centennial of the country in 1876, there was a money-making venture to raise the Augusta and put it on display for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And they got it up and they drug it up to Gloucester. Let me back up here. Do I have it on a map? No. All right, I'll show you Gloucester later. I don't want to get too far out of control here. They drug it to the New Jersey coastline at Gloucester, and that's as far as it got. And as late as the 40s, these are pictures I found online from the 40s, the ribs of the ship could still be seen at low tide. Even more interesting, I think, is that the interior woodwork, the paneling, was removed from the ship, and they are now the interior woodwork for the DAR headquarters right here in Washington, D.C. All right, the Augusta. All right, and now the Americans did pull some stuff off that ship, including some of her guns, and they were taken to Fort Mercer. Now, later on, when the real heavy fighting for Fort Mifflin's happening, one of the Augusta's guns that was at Fort Mercer exploded, kind of like the other one I showed you. And they found this through archaeology about 3-4 years ago. And it's now on display at the fort, hence the picture. But that's a piece of one of the Augusta's guns that exploded later in the campaign. Okay, so now it's all about Fort Mifflin. The Fort Mercer thing did not work. All right, so eventually they're going to build all these land batteries. You could see them all here. The fleet is going to get up into position. And by November 10th, a massive bombardment of Fort Mifflin is going to take place. Initially, it's just from the land batteries, but by November 14th, the British fleet's going to get involved. And then on the 15th, they get 2 ships right up into this back channel to add their weight to this. So I do have a few quotes here. This is November 10th, Samuel Smith. He's the commander of the garrison at this point. He's going to get wounded later on, but at this point, he's still in command. He said a continued discharge on the fort was maintained the whole day from the hospital and battery of shot, shells, and carcasses. Who do I have here? This is James Parker. He's a loyalist, kind of hanging out with the British Army. He's from Virginia. And he said a brick chimney on the rebel fort was broke down and a good deal of damage done to the front of their battery parallel to our middle one. I have a million quotes in the book. I'm just giving you some examples for each day here. The next day, James Varnum, he's technically the overall commander of all the troops in these forts, but he's never going to actually be in Fort Mifflin. He's trying to do it commanding from New Jersey. He said the enemy have battered down a great part of the stone wall. The palisades and barracks are prodigiously shattered. All right, another day goes by. The French engineer in Fort Mifflin is Francois de Fleury. And I couldn't find an image of him, but when I was searching for an image of him, I found this. So the U.S. Army engineers still give out awards for engineering excellence called the De Fleury Medal, named for him. I discovered this while I was making the PowerPoint. And that's a picture of one of the medals. I thought that was kind of cool. So I used the medal to represent him. All right. He writes, the fire of the enemy has been successful enough to spoil our 3 blockhouses and dismount the cannon of all. Okay. This is Friedrich von Munchausen. He's a Hessian officer on William Howe's staff. And Howe rode down on the 12th to observe the fighting for Fort Mifflin. And Munchausen was there. He says, everything is swampy. And besides, one is very exposed to enemy shells if one does not happen to be standing in one of these batteries. All right, next day, back to De Fleury. It is impossible with mortary mud alone to make works capable of resisting the enemy's 32-pounders. There's an account, I didn't include it here, but this is so watery. Some of the British shells are landing in the mud and then exploding after they sink in the mud, and they were shooting mud geysers up into the air. I mean, that's how watery and muddy the fighting conditions were. This is, I'm trying to remember who that is, John Peebles. He's a British grenadier officer, 42nd Highlanders. He says, these rascals on Mud Island hold out well and fire a shot now and then. They just can't give these Americans to give up. Joseph Plum Martin, you probably know him, right? Private Yankee Doodle is the name of his memoir. Now, you have to be careful with his book because it's written many years later, but he's got some great quotes. He's in Fort Mifflin during all this, and he's got some great Fort Mifflin quotes. This is just one of them. As their point blank shots would not reach us behind the wall. A lot of them were hiding behind the wall on the riverside, so they weren't getting hit by the land batteries. They would throw elevated grape shot. It would come down like a shot of hail about our ears. So that's Martin. I got another one here. This is Karl von Barnmeister. He's another Hessian staff officer. He's a major. He says the enemy garrison shows the greatest steadfastness in their defense. Back to the 15th. Now, this is when it really gets ugly, because now the British fleet is completely involved. It's about 250 British guns are going to open fire on November 15th. It's the largest artillery bombardment until Pickett's charge in the Civil War in North America. It is a massive amount of metal hitting Fort Mifflin on November 15th. And this is what Martin writes, that those guns all playing at once upon our poor little fort, if fort it might be called. By this point, there's nothing left. It's just a pile of rubble, bits of rock and shattered timbers and beams. There's no walls left standing. It's shocking anybody survives this. But about 150 of them will survive it. And on the night of the 15th, there's nothing left to defend. So as a matter of pride, the Americans abandon the fort on the 15th and row across the Fort Mifflin, the survivors. Again, there's about 150 of them. But they didn't take the flag down. They left the flag flying. So they never technically surrendered the fort. They abandoned it. And the British will occupy the island the next morning. And this is Loftus Cliff writing to his brother. He's a lieutenant in the 46th Foot. Says, I am told that when our people came on it, meaning the island, it was one clot of blood. Every corner contained limbs, skin, and guts. So just imagine that scene at the end of this bombardment. And nobody, most histories of the war overlook it or gloss over it. And I think Joseph Paul Martin nails it in his memoir. Like, why is it ignored? And there's this quote, I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me. He writes in his memoir, it's not talked about because Washington, Knox, Greene, or Putnam were never there. And so everybody ignores it because none of the big names were there. But I'll tell you what, there's 150 guys that survived it, and the ones that were killed there deserve to be remembered for what they did there. Okay, so that's November 16th. So there's really little left that the Americans can do, but they still technically hold Fort Mercer. They also have a small battery on the Mantua Creek here. And so Howe orders Charles Cornwallis to cross over back over to New Jersey. This is November 18th, along with freshly arrived reinforcements from New York City to eliminate these last little issues in New Jersey. On the 19th, the Americans abandon the Mantua Creek battery and start to fall back. And on the 20th, James Varnum is going to give up Woodbury and therefore the garrison at Fort Mercer and withdraw to Haddonfield as Cornwallis approaches. Let me back up here. That same day, the remnants of the American fleet, those galleys and small schooners, are going to attempt to sneak past Philadelphia and get upriver to save what's left of the fleet. And in that process, the British catch them because they're trying to do it at night. And all this, to make it simple, the British open fire and most of the fleet catches on fire. Now, some of the ships will escape, but most of them are going to burn in the river and be lost on the 20th, the night of the 20th into the morning of the 21st. And there's a great civilian account from a guy named Robert Morton. And so these ships were burning all day. And he was on the Philadelphia waterfront. He said, as the tide came and went that day, the burning ships were floating up and down the river. It's just a great visual of the destruction of the fleet. So the 21st, Nathaniel Greene brings over troops from the main army. Washington's, most of the armies camped up here at Whitemarsh at the time. And Greene's going to come over to New Jersey to reinforce Varnum because they're looking for a chance to fight Cornwallis in New Jersey. They're looking for a chance. Cornwallis doesn't care at this point. He has eliminated Fort Mercer. He just wants to go to the village of Gloucester here, which, by the way, is where they had towed the Augusta. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. And ferry back to Philadelphia. He did what he had to do. And so Cornwallis is going to move to the Big Timber Creek on the 23rd. And there's now an American detachment at Haddonfield here. And he's going to move to Gloucester on the 24th. Late on the 24th, Marquis de Lafayette, who has recently returned to the army. Now, if you're not familiar, Lafayette had been wounded at the Battle of Brandywine in the left calf. And he had spent the next couple months recovering from that wound up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And he had only recently rejoined the army, but he still does not technically have a command at this point. He's a two-star general without a command. He's only 19 years old, remember. But he decides to go with Greene on this operation. He's looking for something to do, kind of like at Brandywine when he got wounded. And he is going to decide to take a small detachment, and you can see it here. It's a dotted line on the map, and scout out Cornwallis's position, his camp at Gloucester. And he thinks there's an opportunity to attack the outposts that are guarding and protecting this operation as he's ferrying back across the river. And that's how you're going to get the engagement or the Battle of Gloucester. It's November 25th. You can see it here on the map here. Lafayette's going to lead these detachments down this main road and hit these outposts made up of Hessian Jaegers. And I gave you just one quote here to give you a flavor of it. Here's Lafayette. I take the greatest pleasure to let you know, he's writing to Washington, that the conduct of our soldiers is above all praises. I never saw men so merry, so spirited, so desirous to go on to the enemy. So Lafayette makes a name for himself here. Not that Brandywine didn't help that, but when he returns to the army from New Jersey, he's going to get command of a division. And he will hold a divisional command for the Whitemarsh operation, which takes place right after this. All right, so we're just about done here, and I did pretty good on time. So after the little skirmish that Lafayette has, Greene decides not to do a full-scale attack on Cornwallis, and that's going to allow Cornwallis to return to Philadelphia. And so by November 27th, the fighting for the Delaware River comes to an end. I think that's my last slide. Yes, I'll take questions in a second, but I got to get my promos out there real quick here. All right, so I do have copies of all these in the back if anybody's interested in a book. But also, if you happen to be from the Philadelphia area or you're going to be up that way, on October 4th, I'm giving a tour of those 3 river fort sites. And you just got to email me if you're interested in that to sign up. Throw my promo out there before I take questions. All right, I think I did pretty good on time. Yeah, let me get a sip of water. I'll take your questions.
I could just remind everyone that if you do have a question, please raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone so everybody online can hear you.
Yeah, please feel free to ask because I skimmed over a lot of details to cover all that. So.
Just because I can't exactly remember, you said that was just the one battle that the Americans won. But what happened at Paoli? Are you not considering that part of Philadelphia?
Well, that's part of the Philadelphia campaign, but the Americans didn't win that. So just real quick, they lost Cooch's Bridge. They lost Brandywine. They lost, well, Battle of Clouds is a loss, but it almost isn't a battle. Paoli's definitely a loss. Germantown's a loss. Billingsport's a loss. Fort Mifflin's a loss. Well, Gloucester, that little skirmish, you could call that a win, but that's a very minor little skirmish. And the fighting that's going to break out at Whitemarsh after the river fighting is all losses for the Americans. And then the fight at Matson's Ford right before they go to Valley Forge is also an American loss. So Mercer's the only time that's a clear-cut victory. Yeah. At least in this campaign. Yeah. Oh, there's a.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
My head stuck on a detail. Can you describe the process of inserting and removing those river obstructions?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it's not an easy process. So the description I have found, I actually struggled to find anybody that at the time that described how they did that. My best guess, based on the sources I could find, they built the cribs on land, or at least near the shore, and floated them out to where they wanted them in the river, and then threw the stones in while they're in the river floating, which made them sink. And the spikes would have already been inserted before they floated them. And I think the chains are attached after the fact, I think. Yeah, I think that's my best guess on the process. Well, the British basically are going to hook hawser line, tow line to them with their longboats from their frigates and literally drag them out of the way. Which is why I think a lot of them are still in the river, which is why when that big storm churned up the mud, some of the pieces came to the surface because they didn't actually, I don't think most of them did not actually get removed. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So this is in your new book, but you didn't have time to talk about it.
Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
It's about the Conway Cabal. So from your research,
Yeah.
spread, would you say this loose network of officers was to protect?
It's not, it's more widespread. It's a good question. I would say it's not as widespread as you think. All right. It's amongst some disgruntled people. Conway thinks he deserves to be a major general, and not just a brigadier general. There's some people that used to be on Washington's staff that are no longer happy with the way the war's going, and because they're not because he removed them from staff, they took it out against him. So just Joseph Trumbull, Thomas Mifflin, and they are for reasons I'm not entirely clear about, Benjamin Rush, who is a surgeon for the Middle Department, has something against Washington. I'm not abundantly clear on what the origin of that is. So it's a pretty small cadre, and they are the ones that are going to write to Gates and try to convince Gates, Horatio Gates, for those of you who don't know who I'm talking about, who had won against Burgoyne at Saratoga, that guy, that he should replace Washington as commander-in-chief. That's the origins of the cabal, and it's called the Conway Cabal because Conway writes to Gates. So that's the origins of it. But the reality is the real cabal, which I start to get into a little bit in the book, but the book ends as they arrive at Valley Forge. I don't really, in this book, get into what happens once they get there. The real cabal is not the movement to replace Gates. That's what we traditionally have been told. The real cabal is the Congress creates a new board of war with the power to overrule and run Washington's army. And that board of war is going to be Trumbull, Mifflin, Gates, and eventually Timothy Pickering, who's going to be replaced as the Army's adjutant general by Washington. So those four people that already don't like Washington suddenly are going to get the power to control Washington's army. That's the real cabal. And Washington, again, I don't get into this in the book because it comes later. The brilliance of Washington to steer out of that is he can't write to the president of Congress without it being an official document to Congress. So anything he writes to Henry Laurens is official. But Henry's son, John, is on Washington's staff. John can write to Dad, and it's not an official communication. And so Washington uses John and Henry uses John to navigate around taking the power away from the Board of War through John and John's letters. And that's going to happen later in the winter. And by the time they leave Valley Forge, I'm getting really long-winded, I apologize. By the time they leave Valley Forge, Washington has suppressed the cabal. Did that answer your question? Okay, all right.
What were the balance of forces in this whole campaign? How many?
Oh, well, it's going to change as time goes. So at the beginning up through, say, late October. Well, yeah, we'll say late October. It's Washington actually outnumbers Howe, which most people don't realize. Washington, if you go and look at the troop strength returns, which are available in Timothy Pickering's papers up in the Massachusetts Historical Society, has about 17, including militia, about 17,000 men, give or take, at any point through late October. Howe actually has less than that. He's around 15, 16,000 through the end of November, actually. It takes him longer to get reinforcements. Now, what happens as the campaign goes on, initially some brigades from the Hudson Highlands are going to join Washington. And then later, after Saratoga is over, Gates's army is going to join Washington. So the brigades that fought at Saratoga end up at Whitemarsh and Valley Forge. So by the time the Whitemarsh operation happens in early December, Washington has about 24,000 men. It's a massive army. Howe has now received some reinforcements from New York, but most of that is going to replace his losses from the campaign. So Howe for the Whitemarsh operations around 18,000. And there's a myth out there, which I discovered writing this when I actually discovered it working on the Whitemarsh section. When I could prove that Washington had 24,000 men at Whitemarsh, a bell kind of went off in my head. Well, how many guys showed up at Valley Forge, which is only 3 weeks later? And I went on Valley Forge's website, and Valley Forge says, oh, only 11,000 guys march in the Valley Forge. I'm thinking, something didn't make sense. How do 13,000 guys disappear in 3 weeks? It didn't make sense. So me and a fellow historian, I'll give him a credit because him and I worked on it together, Gary Eckelbarger, we started digging into the troop strength returns, which are available to any historian, and we can prove minimally 20,000 men marched in the Valley Forge. So this long-standing myth that only 11,000 showed up there is just not true, which actually makes the story of Valley Forge even better or even more interesting because we always know about the logistics problems of Valley Forge, but there were a lot more people they had to feed than 11,000. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, yeah, okay. Anybody else?
We do have some Zoom questions.
Yeah,
Take
I'll
those.
go as long as
Yeah,
you want me to go.
Yeah, we won't keep you here long, too long.
Yeah.
But one viewer wanted to know how big of a role did loyalists in Philadelphia play in the operations for the British movement?
No, it's a good question. So early in the campaign, major role. The biggest name is Joseph Galloway, former Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, used to be a friend of Franklin's, actually was on the first Continental Congress. But when the Congress chose to go to, in his eyes, the extreme of Declaration of Independence, he didn't want that. So he breaks with the Patriots at that point and flees to New York City and gets the ear of Howe. And he's going to be with Howe for the whole campaign. He's the guy that recruits the scouts to get them through Maryland. He's the guy that recruits the scouts that finds the flanking route at Brandywine. He's the guy that brings in the warnings that there's Americans camped behind him at Paoli. And then when Howe occupies Philadelphia, Galloway is going to be made this de facto civilian governor of Philadelphia because Howe's going to create this charade that there's civilian control of the city. So some of the loyalists that had not fled the city yet, he's going to install into positions of sheriff, and I can't remember all the titles, but he's going to appoint some of the big name civilians that are still in Philadelphia into these civilian governmental positions, even though they're not going to have any true power. But that all kind of stops once they get into Philadelphia, because now Washington controls all the area outside of Philadelphia. And so his source of information from the countryside gets cut off. So up until the occupation, they play a huge role, and then that kind of goes away after that. Yeah.
Couple more?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's up to you.
So-
You tell. Yeah.
We talked a lot about, how Fort Mercer was the only American victory throughout this campaign. But I mean, everything that you described tonight, that had to have been a morale victory for the Americans. In your research, did you come across British accounts? How was morale? Was it extremely low?
No, that's a good question. So because that's kind of a two-part thing. Let's start with the British. The British are a bit demoralized when they get news of Saratoga. That's a gut check. And there's lots of officers that mention it in letters, diaries, journals, Hessian and British. It's a gut check. The Americans, shockingly, their morale soars. They weren't even that upset after Brandywine because they did not necessarily fight badly at Brandywine. They just got out-generaled at Brandywine. So, the lower ranking guys at Brandywine didn't feel that bad about that. And again, even though they lose at Germantown, they are like exalted that they almost beat the British army in an offensive attack because they were this close to winning that battle. And they knew that. And that's a morale boost. And then, Washington is still contemplating attacking the British even in December. Just to give you an example, and again, I don't cover it, but just to give you an example, they're only at Valley Forge 5 days, and he's already contemplating a Christmas Day attack on Philadelphia. Because Washington still thinks the army is ready to go. He wants to fight. Washington is aggressive. That's something else I've learned. Washington is far more aggressive than we give him credit for. And he's looking to go at them every chance he gets. But one thing that I think is overlooked and I did cover this in the Germantown book, is that when you look at the French documents, Germantown meant as much to the French as Saratoga. That the main American army launched an offensive attack against the main British army. Yes, they lost, but that is mentioned in the documents in France as side by side with Saratoga. So, even though this doesn't turn out well in a lot of the battles, it's a key factor in the French alliance. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well,
Family lore has my mother's family had some deserted Hessians.
okay.
I'm always curious.
Yeah.
To hear sort of, how did the Hessians fight versus the British regulars? I mean, we always hear they're involved, but I very rarely hear much about sort of the quality of their actual.
No, that's a good
action.
question. I'm trying to think about how I want to answer that. The British don't like them. So then that begs the question, why? They're slow. They're methodical. They're not bad soldiers. Don't take it that way. But they stick to their German teachings and don't go beyond that. One of the things we need to remember about the Hessians is they're not subject to British discipline or rules. They're their own army. They were just ordered over here by their princes. So they still follow the orders of their officers. So, yeah, I mean, as an example, at Brandywine, they're in a reserve role behind the front line going into Brandywine. And once the British begin their attack, the British were trained that after they fire a volley or two, rush the Americans with the bayonet and overwhelm the American line. The Hessians aren't going to do that. They're just sticking to their methodical march and approach, and they can't keep up with the British advance. It's why the Hessians have very few casualties at Brandywine, probably because of overshot artillery rounds. And there's British officers that complain about them not being able to keep up after Brandywine. Another example. So then that begs the question, why are they picked for Mercer? They weren't bloodied. They were fresh regiments. Most of the British regiments by mid-October had been bloodied at either Brandywine or Germantown, some of them both. So the British regiments were not in the same condition they were when they had landed in Maryland at the end of August. But you have all these Hessian units that have not done much. Now, with the exception of the Hessian Jaegers, they had fought well in every fight up until this point. But the Hessian Grenadiers and the Hessian infantry regiments were untouched, pretty much. That's why they're picked. And there's also some theory out there that von Donop was looking to get the honor of the Hessians back. The Hessian officers heard the rumblings. They knew that they were being talked about. And remember who got captured at Trenton? Hessians. And they had not had an opportunity after Trenton to redeem themselves. So there's some evidence that von Donop argued for the honor of taking Hessians on that attack. He did not think there was anything to fear in that assault. Why did he think there was nothing to fear in that assault? When was the last time the Hessians assaulted an American fortification? Does anybody know? Fort Washington, which was a pushover. But that was a different American army then. It's not the American army they're fighting in 1777. And there's Hessian officers that talk about it in the aftermath of Mercer that survived that the memory of, I'm going to paraphrase, that the memory of Fort Washington and the need to correct Trenton caused the rashness of Mercer. So I was probably long-winded again, but does that address? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
A couple more.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm
So
good.
One viewer would like to know, this is another two-parter. During the British siege on Fort Mifflin, did the Pennsylvania Navy or the Continental Navy, one, fight the British Navy during the bombardment, and two, rescue the defenders of Fort Mifflin, or attempt to?
Well, no, they definitely rescued them. Let's start with that part, because that's the only way they could get back across the river. So that part, yes. Now the naval contingent for the Americans gets a little complicated. There's times where they do well. But they don't have these big frigates. They don't have big men of war like the British do. Mostly what they're fighting in are these little single sail galleys that only have a single cannon in the bow. And if the weather's rough, like if it's choppy, those boats don't maneuver well. It has to be kind of calm for them to be able to maneuver anywhere near a British ship or into the back channel behind Fort Mifflin to drive. Remember I said 2 British ships got up behind Fort Mifflin? So there's a bunch of American officers that are going to badmouth the Navy. I quote it all in the book because they don't think the Navy did enough to help them. But when you read Hazelwood's, the Commodore's account, he said as soon as his galleys entered that back channel, all those British guns opened on them with canister. You know, think about, I mean, if you think back to that map I had, that back channel is right next to those British batteries. So as soon as one of those little boats tried to enter it, they were getting swamped by canister fire and were really unable to get into that back channel and do anything. I think the Navy gets too harsh of a criticism. They did not have the material or even the manpower to confront what they had to face in that river. That was from Zoom, wasn't it? Yeah. So hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one final question. You just drew, you just compared Germantown and Saratoga as 2 important things to the French. General Howe often gets blamed for things that went on in Saratoga, as you mentioned earlier in the presentation. But did this long, drawn-out Philadelphia campaign, especially what's happening along the banks of the Delaware, did that have how big of an effect did that have or influence on Howe's resignation later on?
That's a
He's
good.
obviously getting frustrated.
No, he does. He is going to resign right before the orders for Fort Mercer. He officially sends his resignation. It's really in the aftermath of Germantown. I'm not even sure he knew about Saratoga I'd have to go back and look at my notes of the actual dates when he finds out Saratoga versus the resignation. It's pretty close, but I don't think he knew about Saratoga when he resigned. But it's going to take several months for him to get the approval from London to go home. In fact, he won't go home till June of 78. So he ends up fighting the rest of this campaign. You could argue with his head not in the game. He doesn't want to be there anymore. It's hard to prove what he's thinking because we don't have any of his personal writings. The only stuff we have from him are his testimony to Parliament when he goes home, which is official, and I would imagine he's careful what he says to Parliament, and his official reports and letters to the King and Lord George Germain. We don't have his letters because his wife burns them after he dies. So his personal thinking is kind of a guessing game, but based on how I don't think his head's in the game anymore. That's my best answer. Yeah.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Mike, thank you so much for coming and speaking for us tonight. Thank you all for coming out and joining us in person and attending virtually wherever you may be on Zoom. And as always, for your continued support of our mission. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. Get home soon.
Thank you.